ready for some heated panel discussion. My name is Babak. I'm going to moderate this esteemed panel of ours. I'm the former, I should say, VP of Product and Engineering at Arteris. Some of those faces out there that I see are familiar with Arteris, so it's fun to see all of these familiar faces here tonight. Thanks to all of our attendees. We have some stats on the people that are here tonight. So I thought I'll show this for especially the panel, but everyone else as well, to know what kind of audience we have here tonight. It's a good mix, pretty nice intersection of our industry, I should say, with, of course, lots of people here from enterprise and corporate world, startups, of course, technical people, engineers and whatnot, and some students and researchers as well, of course. Medical professionals is, I would say, the larger proportion of that blue sector there. You all also voted on who you would think are the top adopters of AI. Here are the results of those votes. It's probably good to point out that providers there actually includes reading groups. It's about 50-50 between reading groups and hospitals there. But then, yeah, of course, pharma and tech companies and researchers following that. And last but not least, these are the topics of interest as you guys voted. Unsurprisingly, AI, ML, and imaging technologies are the top votes there that you want to hear about tonight. I'll make sure you get to hear about those. If we look at the breakdown of the AI, ML portion, again, unsurprisingly, generative AI, medical imaging is about half of that. And then, of course, many of you are interested in what the challenges and limitations of that are, not just the promises. And then performance, validation, role in clinical decision support following closely. So given that, together with our panel, I've prepared the following general themes that I think we ought to talk about here tonight. Generative AI and multimodal models, obviously, hot topic. We'll dive into that tonight. Data sets, representations, and biases, mistakes, responsibilities, liabilities, risks, and mitigations of those risks. And of course, we also want to know how does this get deployed, so and integrated into workflows. So deployments, workflows, interoperability, and sustainability of those deployments. And then, of course, last but not least, the impact of AI on healthcare access, cost, and quality. So with that, I want to, I guess I'll just introduce our panel, and I'll ask the panelists to one by one come and then have a seat. First out, we have Dr. Nina Kottler. I'll give a brief introduction. Dr. Kottler has been a practicing radiologist specializing in emergency imaging for almost 2 decades. Combining her clinical experience with a graduate degree in applied mathematics, she has leveraged technological innovation to enhance value in radiology. As the first radiologist to join Radiology Partners, Nina has occupied multiple leadership roles within her practice and is currently serving as the Associate Chief Medical Officer for Clinical AI at Radiology Partners. Additionally, Dr. Kottler is an Associate Fellow at the Stanford Center for Artificial Intelligence in Medicine and Imaging and participates on committees for RSNA, ACR, and SIM, for those of you who know what those are. Dr. Kottler, pleasure to have you here. Round of applause for Dr. Kottler. Next, we have Dr. Gurson. Mr. Gurson has a successful history of launching ventures that started when he was just 16. His entrepreneurial spirit has led to numerous startups and acquisitions over a 20-year career in tech. Currently, he's the CEO of Rad AI, where he leads a team of physicians and technologists in developing solutions to enhance the work of radiologists, ultimately saving time and improving patient care. Doctor is also deeply involved in investing and offering strategic guidance to promising young companies, helping them realize their full potential. Pleased to have you here, Doctor. Next, apparently, we have Brad. Mr. Brad Genereaux is the global lead for healthcare alliances at NVIDIA, where his work focuses on accelerating AI, deep learning, visualization, and analytic solutions across medical imaging. With a fervent commitment to revolutionizing healthcare, Brad has dedicated over 20 years to integrating advanced medical imaging workflows seamlessly into clinical practice. His expertise extends to developing turnkey healthcare solutions at an enterprise level, a champion for imaging interoperability within the healthcare ecosystem. Brad has actively contributed to building and implementing standards such as DICOM, HL7, FHIR, and IHE, ensuring a more connected and efficient future in medical imaging. Nice to have you here, Brad. All right. Next, we have John. Dr. Axerio-Cilies is the Senior Vice President and Head of AI Apps Engineering at Tempus AI, where he oversees engineering and product for the AI Applications Business Unit. This unit encompasses several sub-business units focused on genomic, algorithms, digital pathology, radiology, cardiology, and generative AI engineering, of course. John and his team at Tempus are at the forefront of developing LLM-based tools aimed at structuring unstructured healthcare data for both internal and external use. Before joining Tempus, he was the CEO of Arteris and my former boss, which Tempus later acquired. Arteris pioneered AI algorithms in various radiology modalities and famously got the first FDA clearance for a deep learning algorithm in medical imaging. Nice to see you again, John. Last but not least, Dr. Shreyas Vasanawala, the William R. Brody Professor of Pediatric Radiology at Stanford Children's Hospital. And after earning a degree in biophysics from math degree from Caltech, and a biophysics degree from Stanford University, he's led significant advances in MRI technology, focusing on making pediatric imaging faster, more precise, and less reliant on anesthesia. Dr. Vasanawala's team has developed specialized MRI coils for children, introducing cutting-edge image reconstruction techniques, and set new standards for capturing high-quality pediatric images safely. Their work has made Stanford's children a leader in pediatric MRI globally. With over 150 publications and 25 patents, Dr. Vasanawala's contribution to medical imaging cannot be overstated. All right, that's our esteemed panel. Let's hear it for the panel. And I'm gonna sit over here, and I want to open up with a question for all of the panelists. Maybe you can all take a few minutes to answer. I'm personally very curious, and I think our audience might be as well. How do you yourself personally use AI today in your everyday life? Chris, why don't you start?
Well, thank you very much. It's great to see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. So I wind up using AI actually quite regularly, and I would say even throughout the day. There's a range of applications. So I'm, as Babak had mentioned, a pediatric radiologist. I practice a lot of MRI, a lot of CT. We use AI algorithms for the analysis of some of these images. So, for instance, we do a lot of work with imaging hearts. AI is used to auto-process this and determine the function of hearts for children. We also use some AI algorithms to automate the detection of lung nodules on CT scans. And you may wonder, well, children get those. They do actually usually metastases from certain cancers. And in addition to that, a big area where I use it, but it's a little bit indirect, is that we use a lot of AI techniques to form medical images from less data. So whether that means from MRIs that are faster or from CT scans that have a lower dose, you can use these types of technologies to still get good quality diagnostic images. And then, of course, I'm using, the large language models to generate letters and things like that, just automate my day. So, yeah.
Unsurprising. John, how about you?
Yeah, for me, it's much more operational. I think I spend a majority of my day in meetings, and for me, it's mostly ChatGPT, and we basically developed our own internal tools in order to be able to upload our own files, our own data
Meaning closed
within our walls. Yeah, so that's something that's like probably pretty hot topic, is like when we send that data to Microsoft, like what are they doing with that data? So at the end of the day, and I'm sure like there's folks that can answer that question here, but at the end of the day, like data privacy is really critical, and I think that's an area where we spent a lot of money just developing these.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to talk about data privacy tonight. Brad, how about you?
Office uses of AI and Copilot and things like this. The things that I spend most of my time with AI is teaching AI. One of the things that NVIDIA does is build toolkits that helps accelerate the development of AI solutions. And there's a framework that I cover day in, day out called MONAI, which is really just a framework to be able to train and fine tune models, to be able to create ground truth and be able to package these things up. And so I work with developers day in, day out and helping them with AI and building solutions for whatever problem they're trying to solve.
Fantastic. Thanks, Brad. Doctor.
Yeah, so for me, I would say Google Workspace is probably where I use it most. And the reason for that is because oftentimes I've found that it's getting good enough to now where if you want to write an email and you can just describe your intent. So if someone's asking me if I could meet on a certain day, I just want to be able to say, yes, I can meet around this time or on these days. And I want it to be able to just fill that in versus me having to write something that's a little bit, let's just say, more formal and nice. But what I really want to say is sort of capture the intent of what I'm trying to do. And I think it's almost there. In most of the cases, it gets it right. But I think over time, it'll continue to improve. And I feel like the part that's missing is probably the integrations to make that easier. So rather than having to use whatever models available there, I'd love to be able to just bring in whatever I want and then have it sort of customized to my own personal style and preferences in terms of how I might respond to an email. I mean, I do cheat right now because I have an EA that will help draft some of my emails. But it would be, I think, for her and myself, it would be a lot easier.
You have a human AI?
Yeah, I mean, that's the part that's like, I think, again, like these things sound great, but it's like almost there, but not quite in most of the cases.
Dr. Nina.
Yeah, sure. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I use a lot of AI both in my role as a practicing radiologist. So I read radiology exams and I'm an emergency specialist. So my specialty is emergency imaging. And it ends up that a lot of the AI out there is really tailored to emergency imaging. So I've been using that for a long time. And we've deployed probably, tens of millions of exams we've run through some kind of computer vision AI, hundreds of millions of exams we've run through some kind of natural language processing or now large language models. And they span across the imaging life cycle that Matt was showing earlier. When you break down what a radiologist does, you break down into all of the components, not just reading, but there's protocoling and there's planning for the exam, there's scheduling, there's looking at the, making sure your work list is in order, there's creating the report, follow-up, peer learning. All of these components have AI and I use those daily. From a personal standpoint, email is a nightmare, right? Like it takes over your life. It is so helpful to have something that can assist with that. I also do a lot of speaking and events and things like that, and they want to know what's the abstract for this? What are your learning lessons? And that can be overwhelming if you have to do a lot of them. I use a massive amount there. And even for creating some pictures in my images, I'll ask, I use GPT 4.0 and I say, here's what I want in an image. Can you create that for me?
Right. No, thank you, Nina. I think that the personal aspect is just on a personal level how we use it. Really interesting question, because everyone wants to know to what extent yes, we're applying this to cutting edge research and solving life and death questions, but if we're not dog fooding it, it raises some questions about, well, why are we tackling the most difficult problems when we don't find a use for it in our just everyday life? And I think generative AI and OpenAI, ChatGPT has definitely shown that we're at a stage where we also dog food it. It's not just applied to these advanced problems. So yeah, speaking of generative AI, obviously, that's I would say the hot topic tonight and today and the era we live in now. There's a lot of interest in the audience and I'm sure in the panel as well about what are the potentials for this new type of technology? What are the potentials short term? What are the potentials long term? And how can it be used in medical imaging and imaging diagnostics? I'd like to sort of open up for sort of free discussion here, but maybe John, you can start us off with, because you drive the whole generative AI efforts at Tempus. There's a lot of focus on that there, a lot of investment and resources. What do you think about that question?
Sure. So if you look back at Matt Lundgren's presentation on his last slide, it talks about trying to bring in the multimodal data. And what does multimodal mean? It can mean like CT, MR, and DICOM modalities, but for me, multimodal is all about those modalities that he mentioned. So like wearable data, EKG data, genomic data, clinical data. Obviously, all the imaging data. There's cellular data. There's pathology data. There's radiology data. There's just a ton out there, and we're spending a lot of investment around how do we bring all that data together in order to create these foundation models that we can then use vector embeddings to do much more with. That's the ultimate goal. I think the question is, for now, we're focused around trying to identify biomarkers from these images that can help inform clinical trials or help identify patients that could benefit from treatment. So we work with life science companies a lot to try to identify these patients. But it's really driven by the business need, and I think that's the biggest missing piece is Matt mentioned this opportunity between where the technology is going and where we're at. I think what's a big driver there is who's paying for this. Mm-hmm. And right now, obviously, for us, pharma is a big payer for us. It's because it's challenging on the provider side. I've been trying to sell to providers for 10 years, and it's hard to extract a dollar out of Stanford.
And you think that's how it's going to remain? It's going to be pharma and not the providers?
I'd love Nina to answer that question. Yeah. What do you think, Nina?
Are you going to pay Nina? I guess what he's asking.
Okay, so you really do have to think of who are you going to sell to based on who's going to get the return on investment. And there's this, I think, falsity that's out there that people think, well, most of this is computer vision AI. It's doing stuff that is doing things that RADs do. So it's helping them. And so the benefit is to them. We actually haven't found that in practice. So in practice, when we look at some of these computer vision models, I'll start with those, it ends up that when you run them, it helps improve detection. A radiologist plus an AI system together has the potential to be better than either one alone. So you end up improving the standard of care, which is fantastic. But quality, who's paying for quality? Not a lot of people are paying for quality, unfortunately, right? It's a fee-for-service system. And it's not significantly making a big dent in terms of RAD efficiency. So if you're asking me what I pay for it, I'm in a radiology practice. The ROI for me to be able to afford it has to be that my RADs are more efficient, and then I can take on more volume with that. And what we found in our practice, if we deployed it, it's about a 1% improvement in efficiency overall across all our exams, maybe 10% for any single study. But the enhanced detection is more like 20%. And enhanced detection in fee-for-service hospitals means you go to those hospitals and then tell them you can enhance the amount of patients that are appropriately now needing follow-up imaging, follow-up care, et cetera, procedures, admission, and that's an ROI for them. So I think with those kinds, it's more of an ROI for hospital. For some of the stuff the doctor's doing, the ROI is more for a physician practice.
What do you think, Shreyas? It must be different in your world.
Yeah, I think in some ways, maybe we have a little bit different practices, right? So on our end, there are some types of exams where the efficiency really goes up quite a bit. So for example, the earlier example I'd listed of lung nodule detection, the detection itself can be faster, but what also can be very helpful is automated report generation, because it can otherwise be rather tedious to document where all of these nodules are and also compare to priors. The flip side of that, though, is that currently a lot of the solutions that are out there are fragmented. So you have this, one solution for chest CT, you have another for this, another for that. And so the overhead for an individual radiologist to now reach out and engage with one particular solution has to be accounted for as well. So that offsets some of the efficiency gain.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, for me, I think what it really comes down to is understanding what the return on investment is. Having worked with a lot of developers in this space, and we say, hey, we can find the lung, and we show this to clinicians, and they say, hey, so can we? We can find the lung. It's not that hard. What's really important is that we understand what is it that will really make the difference. How is it that we can take these technologies and reduce the burden, reduce the impact that it, using these things manually does for the radiologist workflow? Understanding their workflow and building tools that helps them in the job that they're trying to do is what's really going to make the difference. And watching how generative AI has really changed that game. I remember a time when we would we talked about knobs and dials. How do we present a view to the radiologist of what we see in the EMR? And we say, well, if they have this disease, then show this. And if they, it became this massive decision tree. Being able to create, synthetically, what does that picture of the patient look like, to give the radiologist that picture without having to do the needle in a dozen haystacks. That's the game changer, I think.
Yeah.
I just echo that would be something that's extremely valuable. And right now, often we know as radiologists, it would be a great idea to essentially be a post-test reader, right? Like, everything about the patient, and then you're interpreting, as opposed to a pre-test reader where, you're interpreting the exam as an independent, data point. But the volume growth in radiology has been so intense that we just don't have the time to really do, saying. So something that would really automate that, speed it up, is just invaluable.
So I was going to add, I think as we thought about, so when we started Rad AI, we raised some funds from Google. Everything was exciting. We went to a radiology group and we asked them, we had a list of a dozen ideas, and we said, which one of these ideas do you like? And they liked most of the ideas. In fact, we even had one that was a radiology cheerleader, where once in a while it would just jump up on the screen and say, great job. And that was essentially it. But when we asked them, which one of these products would you actually pay for? That was a different conversation.
The cheerleader sat down.
Yeah, basically. We went down the list of ideas, and it wasn't until we got to this one idea about automating impressions. And bear in mind, this is back in 2018. So this is way before GPT and some of the AI sort of advancements in the last year. So we started very early in this. And when we talked to them about whether or not they would pay for that, they said we absolutely would, except at the time, the technology had not quite developed enough to be able to. So we didn't even know if we could do it. It sounded like magic. If we could make it happen, they would in fact pay for it, because then it seemed like it was pretty obvious if we can essentially save them time and effort, reduce burnout, cognitive load, all the things that I think rad groups care about, then it would add value. And because of that product and because of the work we did there, now almost 20% of rads in the US use our product on a monthly active basis. So we have a lot of radiologists using it, enjoying the value it provides. And I would love to say it's just an efficiency piece, but honestly, I think it boils down to that reduction in sort of the mental, the cognitive load and fatigue. That really matters a lot. In fact, I think I was telling somebody earlier, it was the first time we had somebody reach out to Rad AI and say, I'm reaching out because I had a radiologist that wants to join my group, but he would not join unless we have the Rad AI product, the impression generation product. So that was a sort of a validating moment for us. But I think, to touch on one other aspect of it, I think as you think about efficiency, if radiologists are spending 75% of their time generating reports, I think you'd argue that that's sort of the area in which you can save them a lot of time. So if we can help radiologists generate reports, it's almost like the paperwork of radiology consumes most of their time. It's not the image analysis itself, like that happens relatively quickly.
I think it's very interesting what you pointed out there, that at least early on, your guys' journey, probably everyone else building this type of technology for imaging, their journey has to go through from the specifics to sort of the more general, where yes, we're now at a place where broader adoption is something everyone's interested in. But early on, it was always about this specific question. Okay, like what is it exactly you solve for me, and how do you solve it? So with regards to that, like what I guess, Shreyas, maybe I'll start with you. What do you feel is, or in your experience, has been the important aspects of getting specific with, like, what does the AI help with, and how do we measure that? What was it in your practice and in your experience?
Well, so a big component of the work that that I've been involved in is on the image generation side, right? And so there, it's using different types of reconstruction algorithms in order to generate the images that we're looking at day in, day out. So there, it's relatively more straightforward to figure out what is the accuracy, what is the value being delivered. So I can quantify, okay, I can basically get a very reasonable reconstruction error that's quantified and with 20% less scan time, 10% less scan time. And so in some sense, it's easy to make that assessment. On the flip side, now with some of the more modern techniques of image generation, that question has been flipped a little bit because it's a little bit harder to assess, well, what is the meaning of error? So you can quantify it in certain ways where you just look at it very much like, say, a mean squared error or something like that. But from a diagnostic perspective, it's hard. You don't know what is the real implication of that unless you do some pretty painful, lengthy studies. And I think the amount of those studies has actually been lagging relative to the rate at which all of these technical advances have been happening, in that area.
Anyone else want to get to Nina? So first pointed out, this aspect of like errors and mistakes. Is that an equal, like, on one hand you look at the potential and opportunities, all the excitement, but you probably equally need to look at the mistakes, the good and the bad and the ugly. What is your experience in that, especially in reading group practice?
Yeah, it is really important. You have to remember that computers are very different than humans. And even though AI seems kind of like it is a clinical technology, we can't anthropomorphize it to say it's thinking like a human. So when you put a human together with a computer system, there's bias that's generated, and we have to be careful. It's not just bias that's related to the training of the AI, which is present, but there's bias then in the daily use of a radiologist working with AI. And the bias is only an issue if the AI is wrong, right? Like if the AI is right, we could be biased all we want, automation bias or complacency, and the outcome is going to be the same for the patient. So the times you think about it are when the AI is wrong. Now, the other side of the chain is when RADs don't trust AI, which happens as well, and then we don't accept a correct answer. And we have to think of both of those sides. What we found in our practice is that there's more limitations to AI when it comes to the things that the previous speaker was talking about, which was the diseases that are uncommon. Because as a radiologist, you're consuming not the sensitivity, the specificity, or the AUC. What you are consuming is the positive and negative predictive value. Positive predictive value means, as a test says that a study has a certain finding, how often is it right? And what happens is that the prevalence of disease and the positive predictive value are inversely related. So the lower prevalence of disease means you're going to have a much higher or much lower positive predictive value. Actually, They're equally related. So that means you get many more false positives. You're getting more false positives for diseases that have low prevalence. And we found that if you have a disease prevalence that's less than about 1%, which is not uncommon, the positive predictive value really falls off a cliff, and it starts to be far less than 50%, which means more than half the time when it tells you there's a finding, it's actually wrong. And that makes things difficult, because if there is automation bias and we're over trusting it, then all of a sudden we're treating more patients that need to be treated. And people start looking and saying there's all these false positives, and they could throw out the whole, the baby with the bathwater and say, well, AI is not useful. So you have to be very careful. And I think this is where education comes in. There's no regulation right now about how we need to roll these out and what we need to do to educate radiologists or users to make sure they're using it correctly. But it's a really important area, and an area that the studies have found that a specialist with the AI does better than a generalist with the AI, both from a quality perspective, so they're going to get a better diagnosis, and number two, from a bias perspective. A specialist is less biased when the AI is. They can correct that than if you're a generalist.
One thing that I'd add that I think is really important to have a look at, and this is really as we're consuming AI in the radiology space. Once it's a product, once someone's acquired the product, now we're using the product, integrated into our workflow. One of the things that's really important to have a look at is the product's intended use. Right. So this is part of the FDA and CE mark. When you run this through the entire regulatory process, the intended use is a very clear statement on how you can use the technology and how, not really how you can't use it, but really about how you're supposed to use it. And so it's sometimes, I'll say marketing material blurs a line on this is diagnosing the patient. And it's not diagnosing the patient. This might be providing some value to help us triage the patient. Or it might be providing an insight that guides us as a factor as part of the diagnostic process. And the product's intended use is, it is by design very clear on how it should be used. How that knowledge gets out to the radiologists using the product, I think is a good question. Actually, I'm not too sure about.
I love the fact that you mentioned the potential harm that marketing or maybe overhyping does there. So actually related to that, like what do you think is the hype we're seeing now actually doing harm? And this is a question, open question to all of you, doing more harm than good in terms of education, in terms of actual, thoughtful adoption of AI?
I'd say early on, like 4 or 5 years ago, perhaps. I think that the hype now is warranted. I think the hype is allowing us to ask the right questions. I remember 6 years ago where we said, I would talk to clinicians, I want AI. For what? And it was very unclear what that actually even meant. And now we can have a conversation about what it is I wanted to do, how I'd like it to impact my workflow, and we can have meaningful conversations about that. So I think that we're at such a different place than we were 5 years ago, and I think that it's a much better place in terms of how we're talking about this technology.
Do everyone agree with Brett?
I would add something to that. I frankly think hype is always bad. I think it always makes people think it can do magic, and people sell stuff that isn't really ready. People get scared. I mean, it was 2016 when Jeff Hinton, the godfather of AI, said, we're not going to need radiologists anymore. And he even came back again and doubled down and said, oh, it wasn't 5 years, but it was 10. And that's a problem. People didn't go into radiology because of that. And we have a massive problem with capacity and volume mismatch that we talked about here. We don't have enough radiologists to go around. We need more than ever. So while I think the reason why we're in a good place now, at least with convolutional neural networks and NLP that have been out for a few years, is because we've come off that hype curve, not because we're on it. We are, however, on the hype curve for generative AI. And I think we need to be careful there because regulation is far behind, ethics are far behind, and the technology, while there are so many awesome things, and I think everything is going to move toward that, it's going to move, I think a little more slowly than you might imagine, only because you hear about the hype. So you're hearing everything it could potentially do.
If I can add to that too. So I think there's also this issue around, so again, we've been doing this since 2018 with some of the models that we've built, and those models have essentially improved over time, and we've tested them and kind of like made sure that they're very domain specific and trained specifically on that type of data. What I see happening right now is anyone can put something around ChatGPT and then say they're doing something that's the same. I think what ends up happening there sometimes is then it does feel like you don't realize that you're not really comparing apples to apples, you're comparing apples to oranges. And that also leads to, I think, some of the confusion and noise that gets put into the market at times. And so that's, I think, one of the dangers. All of a sudden, like, it's hard to know what is real and what is not. That's one area. The other thing, I think, the types of errors I think that we see with Gen AI, specifically around text too, I've noticed that they're not things that a radiologist, the types of mistakes that a radiologist would typically make. So they tend to be these things where the radiologist is a little confused by why it was confused by something so simple. But I think to the point earlier that Nina made around education, I think educating radiologists around like what LLMs are actually trying to do, which is just to try to predict the next word. It doesn't have this like comprehension of what is in the report. It's just trying to understand what is the most likely next word. So I think the more you educate them, the more I think they can then try to understand where it might fail when it does fail. And then it's a little bit, I think, because again, radiologists, when they're reading, they're also not 100% accurate, right? There's also that piece of it as well, where I think the two together probably the best combination.
Yeah, there's a good counterweight to the hype, especially for radiology, and that is that unlike a lot of other specialties, our errors are like clearly documented for perpetuity, right? There's a report, there's the images, you know, as opposed to like, let's say a physician makes an error in the ICU in their exam on a patient. Never, you know, you'd never know it. Radiology is known very clearly. And so the liability for any error clearly lies with the radiologists who put their name on it. So
you would say it's not with whatever AI company, FDA cleared algorithm.
I think maybe the exception to that would be what Mike Muley presented today, right? And that they are.
Oh, it's on him. It is.
I mean,
he's lying.
In that particular case, I mean, they're taking that on, but I think
Sure.
the vast majority of what I've seen out there and what we've been looking at, it's held, you know, directly by the radiologist that's interpreting it. And, you know, we've sort of dealt with this issue all along, at least, you know, I have in that in our institution, we have a lot of residents, right, and fellows. And, you know, pretty quickly you come to know, working with a particular resident, oh, okay, I got to read these reports pretty carefully, or, you know, hey, this, you know, this one I can go a little bit faster on. And I think AI models are, you know, a little bit similar thing where, you know, you gain some experience with them and you kind of know, okay, how is this, you know, is this too sensitive, too specific, or,
Right.
you know, or other types of errors.
And John, I mean, do you agree with what Doctor said about the generative models and, you know, what we need to watch out for and where they're useful and where they're still in its infancy?
Yeah, I'd say I think where the innovation lies is like how quickly you can edit the results. Like for me, like what's going to happen over the next couple of years is like these human machine interfaces is like for me, like the ideal world is like Shreyas sitting in a reading room where he just like thinks, or he just has a bunch of residents tell them like to pull up the next image. I think like that's where like, you know, I spend majority of my time when I use Gen AI is like just correcting those 1% of mistakes, but I still have to look at everything. So it's still not fully autonomous. Yes, I know it's going to make a mistake, so I'm like constantly looking out for it. I think there's techniques to try to you know, overcome this, like even just pushing it to Claude 3 and then pushing like the same question to another model. And then, like, I think, you know, over the next year, I think it's like there's gonna be huge innovation as to try how to get around these hallucinations.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's a interesting topic in and of itself. The absolute you know, explosion and acceleration of the progress in this area. I would like to switch gear a little bit there and talk about how we actually adopt this. Now, of course, risk mitigation and all of the liability questions are still topics we can can further discuss. But Brad, what do you think in terms of how these are we prepared to, from a interoperability and systems perspective, are we prepared as an industry to adopt these rapidly changing technologies?
Yes.
Okay,
Very simple. Yeah,
perfect.
piece of cake.
You don't agree, John?
Yeah, yeah. And I say this as a part of the standards bodies. So, which is funny. I like that. The standards themselves, we have been spending quite some time over the last 10 years to develop APIs to be able to access the medical images faster than the old DIMSI DICOM standards. We have DICOM Web. We can query, we can retrieve, we can store, we can create objects, reporting and measurements. Those things all exist. We also have profiles with IHE. IHE is the profiling body of standards to say, this is how we run an AI workflow. This is how we communicate AI results. Where we are lacking, where, why the head shake of why we're not ready is because the applications have not yet caught up to where the standards are.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a considerable amount of time from the development of a standard for it to make its way into products that we can consume. DICOM Web, as a standard, started back in 2011. It used to be called WADO, and we evolved it to include a bunch of additional services. But we didn't see that, even just the beginnings of the querying aspects, until like 2017. And you have to rely on the hospital to update their PACS to the most recent version. You have to rely on the PACS vendor to implement it performantly. Sometimes they're bolt-ons and it's not as performant. In order to run these modernized workflows, we need to have the entire ecosystem modernized. And so while the interoperability specifications are ready and I've already thought through what these workflows are, minus what generative AI is going to change, because that is happening so fast that the standards bodies have not caught up to that.
Right.
But from a workflow perspective, when I think about DICOM and FHIR, the specifications at least guide us to how we get to these solutions.
And they were intended for that.
Yes.
From the beginning.
Yeah.
I see. So your answer was a yes with an asterisk. Yes. Okay. All right. John, did you want to, and then Nina, did you want to address that? Because you were shaking your head.
Yeah, no, it's a shit show out there. It is absolute shit show. Like, I think DICOM is great. I think for me to do Gen AI or like multimodal AI, like I need to have outcome data. I need to have like structured clinical data or unstructured clinical notes, like progress notes. And that is like, it's a wild west. At every new site we go to, it's just like, whether it's Epic, Allscripts, Cerner, it's the same thing. It's like every site is completely different in terms of how they structure their data. And yes, you can throw it at. Yep. Yeah, super customized. So like even just like determining the cancer stage of a patient at every site, it's different. It's defined in tens of different ways. And so yes, you can throw Gen AI at it, but it's still like you can also just use traditional NLP. You can use regular expressions. Like sometimes regular expressions are just more accurate than just
definitely more deterministic. And
yeah, exactly. So like that's for me like the struggle in trying to build up these data sets that have that clinical context and bringing in just genomic data, like multimodal data. It is multiple vendors, and it's just like for me, we're still like 10 years away from like moving the needle.
Nina.
I agree. I mean, I'm agreeing with both. There's three parts of the problem, and I think that's why it's confusing. So part number one is having the standards. And we do. Now we've got a lot of the standards, which are the mechanisms of how we do things. The second part is having the ontology that goes along with those standards. And the ontologies were not built for AI. The ontologies were built for different things. So we have to expand our ontologies to move from what they are to take in AI terms. And that is in the process of happening, but it's not quite there yet. So we're missing on that one. That's what John's talking about. It's all over the place. And then the third part is, how do you get people to take it up and actually use it? Right? The vendors, you have to make sure that they are pushing for it. And it's, I as a user of AI, where we use multiple different versions and different vendors, I will tell you, there's as many, if not more ways that we get data from the vendors than from a standard. And it's really difficult because you have to try to consume those. And if they're all using a different mechanism to do it, if they're all using different language to do it, then when you try to bring it all together, it's really, really difficult.
Definitely. Yeah, not to be underestimated. Well, so let's then assume that, we do get the integrations right. We get even workflow deployment integrations right. We even mitigate risk. It feels like we're still going to be back at the question of how is this going to be sustainable? Who's going to pay for it and why? I still feel like, I don't know what the audience feels like, that's still an unaddressed sort of big question mark. There seems to be ideas in the panel about who's going to pay for it at different periods of this sort of adoption curve or hype curve we're on. But where are we going to land in the end? Any thoughts on that?
I'm not sure there's a monolithic answer to who's going to pay for it. I think a lot of healthcare ecosystems, they're very local, right? So one environment is going to be very different from another. But I think one model or one possibility is that we have a number of places where the imaging volumes have grown so dramatically, and it is so rapidly outpacing the ability of radiologists to keep up with it, that it's causing queues in the system. It's holding up patient care. And so in those circumstances, I think health systems may be motivated to leverage these types of technology to get back the throughput.
Right.
So that's just one example of where there would be a very motivated player in the system.
That would want to. Doctor, is that what you're seeing as well in your business?
Yeah, I think that's one area. I think there's certainly on the efficiency piece that we touched on earlier, I think that part does matter, but it has to be significant enough to where it actually makes a difference, right? So if you can all of a sudden, if you could, and I'm saying if you could make radiologists 20% more efficient, where they could read more studies, then they could generate more revenue for that system or for the group. Now, to do that, obviously, it requires, there's a lot of things that have to go well for that to happen, but I think they would be willing to pay as long as you can show those types of results. So I think, again, as the imaging volumes are increasing 10% year over year, I think the other side of that, though, is reimbursement rates are also dropping every year. So just even to stay where a radiologist is at currently in terms of what they make on an annual basis, you do have to account for that. So my co-founder, Jeff, who's a radiologist, a lot of people mistake me for being a radiologist because of my name being doctor. A lot of people confuse me there, but he was telling me, earlier in his career, he was reading a lot less studies, but because of the streamlined work list and all the other things that have been able to be done through technology, he can read more studies. So I think in essence, as radiologists can read more studies, reimbursements will probably drop over time, it'll catch up. But in the short term, I think that is one way. And I think part of that too is finding ways to add additional value. As we're building our reporting platform, I think one thing that we're really trying to be mindful of and intentional about is how do we make it so that you can add value to it very easily? And so making it open, using standard, making it open, I think that's kind of one of the strategies we have in this year and moving forward.
Sounds like good advice for any startups out there.
I would say so, yeah.
But then it sounds like a lot of you, correct me if I'm wrong, that the money and maybe even the willingness to pay is there. It's just that it's tightly coupled with this issue of trust and belief in that this does make a difference. This does actually create value, whether it's patient level or at the sort of business level. How do we build that trust? I'll just many of you, and I'm sure the panel know about this, mention this study that came out, I guess, about a year ago now, from Harvard Medical School in collaboration with Stanford. It was a large study, over 140 radiologists, these chest X-rays. Nina, we talked about it, and that one sort of was a little bit of a cold shower for a lot of people who were hoping that, yeah, this is, going to revolutionize any and every radiologist is going to benefit from this, while that one showed that it's not that clear cut. It might actually be harmful in certain cases. What do we think of that?
Yeah, that was a weird paper, right? All the papers and articles that have come out so far have all shown something very similar. They've all shown that these help physicians. So if you use AI and you're a physician, you generally do better than if you don't have AI. And the benefit is dependent on usually how much specialty you have within that underlying technology. So if you're talking about imaging AI and a radiologist, a dermatologist or a primary care physician or an ER physician, they're going to benefit far more than a radiologist. And a general radiologist is going to benefit more than a subspecialist radiologist. That's what we've seen out there for everything. This paper basically said, no, that's not true. We did not find that. However, if you look a little deeper into the paper, and I have not read it in depth, so check this yourselves. But I don't think that in that paper they had a heat map or some kind of explainability. Because when you are getting a result, you're trying to consume a result from an AI, we don't necessarily understand why it's making that decision. And we get heat maps or explainability parameters that help tell us how is it making that decision, and it allows us as users to be smarter about whether we accept it or not. And I don't think in this paper they had it. So my interpretation, and this is something I've always felt very strongly about, is that to be an educated user, we need to have information from the AI systems that we're using in order to properly consume them and decrease the bias between the two. It's also something that if you look at the FDA decides whether something should be a medical device or not, right? The 21st Century Cures Act came out and they made an update to it and said anything that's called clinical decision support, that does not need FDA guidance because it's not a medical device. So if you look at what clinical decision support is, it has 4 rules. The first one, it has nothing to do with imaging. So if you're touching imaging, you have to go through the FDA. Number 2 is it has to be something that physicians normally speak to each other about. Number 3, it has to be a recommendation and not a directive. And number 4, you have to explain where that recommendation came from. And so that explainability is also a component of whether or not you would go through the FDA. And I think that that is such an important part. As a consumer, if I don't have an idea how the AI made decision, it's really difficult to interpret if I should use it or not. So I think that biased that paper a little bit. Yeah. I still do believe that in a lot of the other.
And that component of explainability again comes back to that issue of trust, right? That we don't quite trust the AI. Shreyas, is that okay? You're the other MD here. Like, is that the thing that the caveats everything?
Well, maybe just a couple of comments.
Yeah.
One is that, so I found that paper a little bit harder to know exactly what to do with it. And I think part of the reason is that when you're looking at a modality like chest radiography, the sensitivity and specificity for a range of diseases in that, for that modality, is a lot lower than what would be the case for other types of imaging. So for instance, if we had repeated that exact experiment that was done, but with a model that was, say, looking at like intracranial hemorrhage on a CT scan, there, it's much clearer, right, with the sensitivity and specificity. And so I feel like we might get very different results when looking at something like that. And in terms of your question about some of the barriers to adoption and trust, one of the bigger barrier to adoption right now is that there's so many moving pieces to the players and the products and the regulatory environment that it can cause a decision paralysis amongst people who want to adopt. And so I think that may be something that actually holds up adoption more so than even the trust side.
I see. Well, I want to just for a few moments longer linger on this, because personally for me it feels like this issue of trust and explainability that of course FDA has been very clear about is a little bit of a conundrum, because neither of you ask a colleague like by default or as a regular practice to explain why they came to a certain diagnosis, right? Or you don't ask them to elaborate their thinking. You kind of just trust their board certified radiologist. You go with their word. Why don't we have this level? And I've personally seen that across the spectrum of AI applications outside of healthcare as well. I mean, autonomous driving is famously another example that these systems can be even safer than humans, but as soon as they do a small mistake, even if it's statistically much more accurate than a human, we don't want to trust them, and we demand more explanation. Why is that?
We do hold computer systems to a higher standard, period, because we don't understand them all. But I also don't need to go to my fellow radiologists and say, why are you giving me this recommendation? Because I know they're not doing something like looking at the left or right label of a chest X-ray and making a decision based on that, whereas an AI system might be. And so I also will only go to certain radiologists. All radiologists are great. I'm a radiologist, but I do go to certain ones that I know better because I know how they're thinking and I trust them more in that area. And so I can pick and choose based on that. If you don't understand how the AI is working, it's really hard to pick and choose.
Sounds like you treat the AI as an idiot savant. Like it's super good, but it can also just be an idiot.
One
Yeah,
thing
Brad?
that I'd say too is that there are times when radiologists have conversations, right? So my first experience in the healthcare space was at an oncology center, and we would have multidisciplinary rounds. They would bring the study up, and you would have a panel, ask questions, work through that potentially complex case. So I think, it's very different than here's an arm and is there a fracture and I see the bone is in 2 fragments. I don't need to necessarily ask a colleague to say, do you think it's a fracture? But, I think depending on what it actually is, we do have those conversations. And, it may be the answer or an answer is we think about the paradigm of something like rounds and what does that mean for AI, right? Maybe that's how we construe how we leverage that insight as part of it. So maybe it's not just, it just shows up and says, hey, here's the cancer, but actually is something that is part of a workflow that we're already accustomed to.
By the way, there's going to be virtual rounds where multiple models are going to be in the round together. So, and humans are just going to supervising.
And I mean, at Tempus, you guys deal with, speaking to Rad's point about multidisciplinary and multimodal sort of inputs, you guys deal with that on a daily basis. Like all of the solutions you build aim to be that type of multimodal, multidisciplinary approaches, right? And do you see that kind of need for, the AI needs to be, as Nina said, held to a higher standard, especially or maybe even in multidisciplinary or multimodal aspects?
Yeah, I would say even higher. I mean, I think what needs to change is guidelines. Obviously, we talked about FDA reimbursements. A lot of what Michael Muley covered. That's what I think needs to be driving some of these trust questions. Real world evidence, like all these things are obvious, but it's lacking right now. Like it's hard to do. It's costly to run these 300-person clinical trials, right? It takes many years. It takes 5+ years. So that's what's lacking. I think if we had more of that, I think that some of these trust issues should start to go away.
Nina?
I also think we're answering the wrong question. Because you need to get AI out there by proving it's as good as a human, then that's what everyone measures. And we look at accuracy labels for AI on its own. We measure humans on their own through peer learning or peer review. But there is no AI, at least in the US, that is being used autonomously. It's all augmenting the radiologist. So why are we not measuring the two together? That's what we need to be doing, and that's what the papers need to start showing. How does a radiologist with an imaging AI or a reporting AI work together to be better? Because it's that understanding of how the AI works and educated with that human, that's what elevates the quality and the role of them together.
Maybe it's part of the lingering damage Jeffrey Hinton made with that kind of dichotomy comparing humans and AI. Yeah.
Although I will say that if you can flag just the positives or just flag cases that don't have anything, and you could take the radiologist out of that. Like there's been some companies doing that, and like the business model around that is clear. I don't know what your take on that is.
So first of all, imagine your day, whatever you're doing. I mean, my day as a radiologist, we're reading like 100 or more studies in your shift. It's pretty intense, right? You're going through all of these exams. You get a little bit of a mental break when you hit a normal. Or you get a little bit of a mental break if you use Rad AI. If someone takes that away, your day is awful. I mean, like all of a sudden, and how we're paid is paid based on the average result. So if our CPT codes and the reimbursement we're getting is based on having some normals in there, then all of a sudden you're being essentially underpaid. And while I think it's nice to be able to categorize exams and put them in chunks, like for screening mammo, that's happening now. In the UK, it's happening because there's double readers. You can use it as a second reader. You could batch these cases together and be more efficient. But I would argue that it is not great to take all of the easy things out of the workflow of a human and expect that our data to be similar. And I think, too, if you take the normals away, how do you know it's abnormal anymore? You just need that as an assessment to go back and forth. It may happen. I don't think it's the best idea.
Indeed.
One of the things that I worry about, right, is I deal with when I look at my email and I have a spam folder and there's a bunch of spam that it's pulled out, and once in a while I'll find something that was really important in that folder, and it's the worst. I feel terrible. I go back to them. I say, I'm really sorry. Somehow your email was identified as spam. The reality is that if we're doing that to our radiology studies, the impact to the patient who is, they're not spam. It could be, there's absolutely real world implications of it. And so I think that it's also really important that as we, utilize these technologies, that we think about the meaningful use behind them as well. So,
Well, now I know where my email went, Brad. So that explains a lot. But I would agree too. It's ultimately about the patient, right? Because I actually recently had some imaging work done, and if I thought that, well, maybe it just gets categorized as there's nothing there, don't worry about it, I don't know how comfortable I would be with that at this point where we're at today. So I think it's really important for also the patients to have the education and understand what's happening as well and get comfortable with the idea. Because I have a lot of radiologists around me, obviously, so I get to send it around, person by person to see what they think. But not everybody has that luxury, right? So I think it is important to make sure that the systems are held to a high standard, and it's only used in those types of cases, especially with imaging, where we know that it's, because although we talk about them in terms of percentages, these are people's lives, right? So I think it's not lost on anybody, I think, up here that, it's important to make sure we get it right as possible.
Just one other comment too, is that, if I, imagine I get imaged, does Brad have pneumonia? And, good news, I don't have pneumonia, but what about those lung nodules that I happen to have, right? So there's other things that could be in there. And just because it's normal for the reason why I was being imaged, maybe for an emergency use case, it is absolutely not normal. I might have other things going on. And so, there should be supplementary AI that can, also run to find those things that are not part of the clinical question, but still need that, deserve answers for. So.
Indeed. I like where this is going now, because it's a great segue to sort of the last topic I wanted to touch on tonight, which is, who this actually benefits. And ultimately, that's, I guess, what we all want to see. Sure, it makes radiologists and maybe digital pathologists and other physicians' lives better and easier and faster. But ultimately, we want it to benefit the patient. So on that, where do you guys think, and this is, again, an open question to the whole panel, about the first sort of low-hanging fruits of benefits that AI, generative AI, and AI in general will create in society? Who will it benefit? And then who will it not benefit? Any thoughts on that?
So one of the biggest benefits will be access. So right now we have a tremendous access problem across the country, but even in the Bay Area, there's challenges with access. And so anything that helps with efficiencies really will benefit the patients in terms of access.
The other way that access is benefited is also, I do believe that AI does help raise the quality of a general radiologist or a generalist to that of a subspecialist. And we're seeing the same thing with techs. And a tech that might not know how to do cardiac MR can use a cardiac MR AI that will help them acquire cardiac MR imaging at the same level. And that allows health equity to improve because you can start giving the same quality of care in these rural areas that normally you wouldn't have people there that have that ability to do that. So access is another one there. There's also the benefit, I think, of we are going to elevate the standard of care and elevate our quality. We've seen that already where we can enhance our detection. So you're getting more of the patients that are the right patients that need to be seen into the system and less of the wrong ones. And that ultimately improves patient care. People on this panel also talked about some of the acquisition time. And if you're decreasing the scan time, but you're maintaining the quality, that's also better for patients. They're not sitting on the scanner quite as long. And kids and patients in pain have really trouble doing that. So I do think there's a lot of patient benefit.
No, this similar line, if you lower radiation doses or contrast doses, there's a lot of things that are out there in that realm that improves quality and safety.
Well, also internationally too. I mean, just in the US, we have relatively good access to imaging, but in some countries, there's one radiologist for every, I think, 10 million patients or people. That's, so improving access obviously would go a long way.
I'll add that if you think about everybody along the clinical pathway, I think having radiology AI could benefit all of those people because it can tokenize or it can make sense of not just the RAD reports, but like there's much more in the raw data. We talked about like reconstruction. We talked about there's just a lot of information in those pixels. So if you can extract information, biomarkers, it could help folks all the way upstream, downstream, and I think that could benefit. So like especially in oncology, especially PCPs, just trying to elevate that information to that they can understand.
That's good to hear, Nina.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. Right now, we are managing patients based on population health guidelines. If you are an average patient, what should we do? Well, no patient is an average patient. So it's the best we can do at the moment, but we are starting to be able to get other biomarkers like John was talking about, more information from the imaging biomarkers, and we can connect it with data from genetics and other profiles. We bring that all together. We start moving from population health medicine to precision medicine and care for individual patients. I think that's going to be a massive change in the future.
Yeah, that's great to hear because I can just for myself say that a lot of the time the fear I hear from the general public, not just with regards to healthcare, but about AI and AI adoption, who it will benefit is that all these new technologies are always going to benefit, the wealthy, the powerful first, and maybe down the line us. But what I'm hearing from the panel unanimously pretty much is that, no, actually in this case, it's going to broaden the access and in fact benefit those who thus far have not had the access or proper sort of access to care that they needed to have much more prevalent.
If someone pays for it.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, I would love to just continue for another hour because I mean, I know each and every one of you and these kind of conversations are really awesome for me. As much as I would love that, we are at time. I would like everyone to give the team panel a round of applause. I do think, Reza, correct me if I'm wrong, we do have some time for questions, right? Like 15 minutes, five minutes? Okay. All right, a couple of questions. All right. I don't know how you want to do with microphone. I can borrow. Oh, okay, all right.
Hi, Ali Abayazid. I'm a practicing neuroradiologist, co-founder and chief medical officer of Neusoma. It's a medical AI company in the neuro-oncology space. I had a question. So right now, the we're still in the narrow AI era, and we're going to be there for quite some time. The amount of AIs that are required, as Matt was talking in his presentation, are in the tens, maybe hundreds of thousands. And we're talking at a very high cost per healthcare system. And I know we didn't speak a lot about who's going to pay for that, but I think it's very important because it seems, at least for now, that the marketplace is unsustainable. Who's going to pay for 10,000, 100,000 AIs? Which health systems are actually going to pay for that? Even if there are reimbursements, the value of the reimbursement is going to be very small, and it's not going to sustain the work of all these AI vendors and AI companies. So if you guys can speak a little bit about that, thank you.
The way that I see it is this is really the next wave of the Industrial Revolution. We can't just take one model and build it at a time. We need a factory to build these models. We need a foundry to build these models, and we need to be able to build them at scale. We have a lot of raw data, think about, just raw goods, and we need to be able to translate that into insights. Getting access to data is, a common refrain in this space. But as we industrialize the inputs, industrialize the process, and then thus industrialize the outputs, that's really where we're going to be able to make a real difference. And we're really starting to see that in the libraries that our developers are using. We look at the applications, the frameworks, the maturation of the software solutions themselves. We are really poised in 2024 to make leaps and bounds in that space. But it really takes not just looking at it one problem at a time, but really how do we solve this at an industrial scale?
Yeah, it is. It's very true what you're saying. When you look at a single model, it may have value, whether that is increasing the detection rate so that a hospital can afford to pay for it, or increasing your efficiency. It ends up that value is not additive. You can't say, well, now you improved by 10%, so I'm going to give you 10 of these and you'll be 100% better. And you'll end up having these length of stays that everyone talks about being negative, right? They'll be discharging the patient before they even entered. And that's not really the case. And part of it is because these AI systems are not necessarily talking to each other. Me as a radiologist, when I see a rib fracture, the first rib, I know it was a very high-speed injury, and I look at the lumbar spine and other parts for other significant injuries, vascular injuries, compression fracture. We actually had an AI system that found a rib fracture. It should be talking to another AI system that then decreases the threshold for calling a compression fracture. All of this could be built into an ecosystem, and there's even more that is starting to now be available. So if you look at some of the big cloud vendors and probably NVIDIA as well, they're creating baseline platforms that will allow you to have an ecosystem of tools, whether they are individual AI narrow tools, foundation model general tools, plus access to different databases and AI and APIs, where you could take all of this information together either through chains or agents and RAGs and put it all together within a system. That is going to be massively valuable. That is just starting to come out this year.
I think we have time for one more question. So I don't know who was first. I pick you, sir. Go ahead.
Hold on.
Hi, my name is Tay. Actually, I'm from the AMD, and I have two questions. One question is around 10 years ago, deep learning come out, image classification accuracy is some kind of better than humans. So at the time we realized, deep learning is the age of deep learning is a start. So same thing for what's the current? Do you have any data of the false positive and false negative for radiologist now? If we have that kind of data, and then if we have some generated, we build up some kind of AI model. If the model is better than some kind of common false positive, false negative data of the radiologist, then maybe we can consider that we can rely on some AI related model, isn't it? And the second question I have is when we scan the radiologist, how long does it take us to generated doctor's note, some kind of note. Because I have no idea, but for example, if I go to some hospital, usually it takes more than 1 week or 2 weeks. So if I want to know some kind of that kind of data, and then I believe we've generated some AI model that's supposed to be not the 1 week, 2 weeks, supposed to be a few minutes. So maybe that's some kind of help.
Basically, two questions. First one about the, accuracy and the level of, again, this comparison between AI and humans, and the other one in terms of speed and, doesn't it open up a whole avenue with orders of magnitude faster diagnosis?
Forgetting your second question, I can start with that one. Language translation, right? Being able to take something that a human is saying and then put that in a report. It's voice recognition for us, but there's ambient technology that does it within a physician that is working with a patient, and it could create the note and standardize the note, and so that could happen much more quickly. What's interesting to me about that is technology in the past has separated physician from the patient. At least in radiology, when PACS came around, we used to talk to every single division because they'd come down to the reading room when it was analog. They didn't have anywhere else to go. Then PACS came along, and all of a sudden we just get, a character-limited history that is insufficient. This new technology is bringing physician back with the patient and physician back with physicians. And yes, it can happen much more rapidly from that. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that.
Who else? All right. Well, we are at time. The panel will be available here for a bit of mingling, I guess. So you can approach them, ask questions from them personally if you still have questions. But once again, a round of applause for our panel. Thank you.